Hello, everybody. Today we are going to be talking about training for performance, and we're going to kind of focus in on some of those exercise prescription principles that will allow us to kind of apply what we've learned so far about aerobic exercise and strength training and kind of understand how to put that together cohesively into a plan that is appropriate and efficient and beneficial for our athletes. So we think about the general training principles. Um, Probably the most important factor that we need to understand and consider when we are designing a training program for our athletes is that the training program should match the anaerobic and aerobic demands of the sport. So again, it's really important that we understand those metabolic systems and understand how those might be applied to sport and how we can mimic those same types of activities within our training. So for example, if I'm working with wrestling, a wrestling match is 7 minutes in duration, which tells us it is at least half, if not more than half aerobic in nature. So we do need to include about half or more of our training should be aerobic when we think about setting up a training protocol for wrestling. Again, we're kind of able to utilize all of the energy systems in a sport such as wrestling. So it's important that we are doing things at high intensity with quite a bit of rest so that we can get high quality. Maybe that's in the weight room, maybe that's a specific drill or something that I can do in my practices. And then also including some of those more moderate intensity aerobic work within that training program to kind of set those athletes up for success in kind of all of those scenarios. One of the training principles that we want to address is known as the principle of overload. And the principle of overload states that we need to give those athletes progressively more work than they were doing before, right? So in order for us to see change, in order for us to see progress, we have to ask our athletes to do more than what they're already doing. Okay, so overload is essentially overloading the body and giving our bodies a greater stimulus than what we were able to handle prior. Okay, so again, we think about overload. Generally, we want to think about this over a week's time. So we want to do approximately 10% more this week than we did last week. And again, that 10% can be transferred into intensity, could be transferred into duration, or something along those lines, right? So again, it doesn't necessarily mean that I need to do 10% more volume. It could be like I make the intensity 10% higher this week in comparison to last week. So lots of different ways in which we can overload the body, but essentially the key principle here is we need to do more or stress the body more than what we previously did in order for us to continue to adapt. The principle of specificity is pretty simple. If you want to be good at swimming, you should swim. If you want to be good at biking, you should bike. If you want to be good at playing basketball, you should play a lot of basketball. So again, we can see the specificity of our training transfer over to success in that sport, right? So again, very simply put, you need to spend time doing the thing that you want to be good at in order to improve. Okay. The principle of reversibility is kind of this idea of if you don't use it, you lose it. So again, just because I could run 6 miles without stopping last year doesn't mean that I can now, right? So again, we have to keep in mind that the body is very dynamic in nature and it will revert back to whatever the most basic or whatever the most minimal level it needs to in order to survive in the environment that we set up. Okay. So we think about the contribution of each of those energy systems. I thought this chart was really nice because it kind of breaks down some of our common sports to give us an idea of, what percentage of the sport is coming from which energy system. I think this is great. So again, if we look at baseball, about 80% of the work that we do in baseball is related to that ATP PCR system. About 15% will come from anaerobic glycolysis, and only about 5% aerobic. So again, if I'm working with a baseball player, their aerobic needs are very, very minimal. So I probably don't need to do a whole lot of aerobic work in order to set them up for success. Okay. If we're looking at a sport like basketball, again, we've got about 80% coming from the ATP PCR system and 10% anaerobic glycolysis and 10% aerobic in nature. I wish I had, I don't really have anything that shows you a lot of aerobic work. But if we were to throw in cross country or like soccer, for example, we'd have a significantly higher contribution from the aerobic system. So again, I think this is really nice if I'm setting up practice or setting up a training plan for a baseball player to kind of keep these things in mind as I design their workouts. Again, most of what we should be doing in their training should mimic the ATP PCR system. And we should only do a tiny bit of aerobic work in order for us to kind of allow us to kind of improve in that regard. Oh, I do have more. So here you can see some additional sports here. Let's take a look at swimming. So a long distance swimmer, again, they're only doing about 10% ATP PCR, 20% anaerobic glycolysis, and 70% aerobic. So this particular person needs to have a huge aerobic base. Almost all of what they do, 70% of what they do is based on their aerobic fitness. So again, we need to plan their training around those principles. Okay, and then lastly here you can see a nice contribution of a variety of sports here. Look at this, a marathon, 98% aerobic and only 2% from the anaerobic glycolysis. And again, very, very little, very minimal amounts coming from the ATP PCR system. If I'm interested in building just a general health for somebody, I would say it's a good idea to really focus on the aerobic system and also the ATP PCR system. So again, doing strength training to kind of mimic activities of the ATP PCR system and doing some kind of moderate aerobic work to kind of focus on that aerobic system. Okay, so when we think about the kind of the application of our training response as it relates to the reversibility of training and overtraining. So here you can kind of see how this all works. So when I do the exercise, so exercise is represented by a dot, that overload causes stress. And that immediate stress is going to cause a potential, I'll say a potential decline in performance. And the reason for that is I need time to recover. Okay, so again, I'm going to be fatigued immediately after the exercise is over. I wouldn't be able to do that same exercise bout again immediately afterwards. And so therefore, you know, I'm kind of down here. And as a result, I'm going to recover from that, but recover and then add some. So we're going to have recovery back to our baseline, but also add a little bit of adaptation, which allows me to improve my fitness. Okay, so the idea is stimulus, recovery, adaptation. Okay, and again, if we do this diligently and plan this well, we're able to gradually increase our fitness over time. Now, what happens when I do too much and don't give myself enough recovery time? We can experience something known as overtraining. And with overtraining, I'm going to give the overload, but recovery isn't long enough. And so therefore, instead of having adaptation, I'm not able to return to my baseline. And so therefore, I'm going to kind of gradually decrease my performance as I go. Okay. Again, when we experience overtraining, it's generally because I didn't give myself enough recovery time between these hard exercise bouts. And again, we'll talk about some of these factors, but essentially everybody's different in terms of how much recovery they need between hard bouts in order for them to be ready for the next one. What about the influence of gender on on training programs and this sort of thing? So men and women generally respond really similarly to training programs. So again, if I'm working with a female basketball player and a male basketball player, it probably wouldn't be necessary for me to change what I'm asking them to do in terms of their training, assuming that the dynamics of men's basketball and the dynamics of women's basketball are the same. Training improvement is always greater with individuals who have a lower initial fitness level. So again, you know, whether I'm working with a male or a female, the more elite they are, the harder it is to move that needle just a little bit. Okay, when you're working with somebody of a lower fitness level, it's easier for us to kind of move up the progression there. And so, when we think about training adaptations and things like that, the more fit I am, the harder it is to see continued improvement, versus lower fitness level will allow us to see improvement a little bit easier. And again, this is going to be true regardless of whether I'm working with a male or a female. Okay. So let's talk about training for aerobic power and how we might do that. Okay. Um, So we're going to use kind of three primary training methods to focus on aerobic fitness, or to allow us to improve those aerobic pathways. Okay, so we can do long or moderate duration, low to moderate intensity workouts. So that's number one. Number two, we can do tempo work, which is going to kind of allow us to push that anaerobic glycolytic system forward. And then lastly, we can do interval work. And I've got a slide to kind of look at each of these, but these training goals, or these training, like these different types of workouts, are going to focus on improving a variety of factors. The long or moderate duration, kind of low to moderate intensity workouts are going to improve aerobic efficiency. So again, kind of building that aerobic base, or building that aerobic engine so that we're better at doing aerobic work. Okay. The tempo work is going to allow us to improve lactate threshold. And lactate threshold is kind of the upper end of aerobic work. It's the intersection between aerobic and anaerobic work. So it's right around like 80 to 90% intensity, 87% intensity, where we are going to see that intersection between aerobic and anaerobic work. And then our our interval work is going to allow us to improve VO2 max and maybe submaximal exercise capacity. So again, kind of focusing on maybe that anaerobic glycolytic or that ATP PCR system as well. We can do, all sorts of different workouts. HIIT workouts are super common, so I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about those. But we can do interval training, or AKA high intensity interval training, or HIIT workouts. And these HIIT workouts are characterized by high intensity interval sessions with very short or easy recovery intervals. Those recovery intervals could be doing another exercise, or it could be like a true recovery where I'm just standing. And what we see with the training outcomes of HIIT workouts are similar to that of what we see with aerobic workouts. Okay, so again, I can do a HIIT workout and I'll see similar adaptations or benefits to what I see for the aerobic types of workouts. Again, these are great. We'll see mitochondrial improvements. We can also see general fitness gains. So these are really nice as a way to maybe cross train, or kind of utilize in our off season, to kind of focus on weaknesses, or kind of change it up as well. So these are great for kind of general fitness. Maybe not super useful in a lot of sports settings. However, it could be a nice thing for us to use for general fitness, or like I said, in the off season as kind of something different to do. If we're interested in gaining strength or hypertrophy, we should use longer rest intervals and make sure that these intervals are really, really good quality, and we're making sure we're recovering between them. Okay, so just a little bit about long, slow distance. So long, slow distance attributes. So using kind of this low intensity or moderate intensity, long duration exercise allows us to improve mitochondrial number, size, and kind of those aerobic pathways. So we'll improve our efficiency from the aerobic perspective. Again, these can be used as kind of a recovery tool. So we can do kind of like a low intensity aerobic exercise bout as part of kind of an active recovery, or we can use kind of our long, slow distance workout as a primary workout for us. And again, based on how long it is, we are going to accumulate fatigue, the longer that workout is. So again, the idea with this is we want to stress and kind of maximize the use of those aerobic energy pathways. Okay. We think about high intensity continuous exercise, or what I call tempo work, or sometimes called lactate threshold work. And with these types of workouts, we want to work at an intensity of, like I said, approximately 80 to 90% 87%, I know that's weird. 87% intensity seems to be the appropriate intensity for us to hit kind of this tempo zone. And imagine that these workouts are what I would call comfortably hard. So I can talk to you, but I can't say like a whole lot to you while I'm doing a tempo exercise or while I'm doing tempo work because it's not all out, but it's pretty good effort wise. And the goal with these is to improve lactate threshold. So we want to sit on that upper edge of aerobic work and maybe even dip slightly into the anaerobic side of things. And again, doing workouts at this intensity allows us to push that lactate threshold forward and allows us to kind of hit that middle energy system pretty well and kind of push that forward, like we said. Tempo workouts should be used sporadically. So again, we can do a lot of long, moderate intensity types of work. Tempo work should be done once per week, I would say. Okay. Here we can see kind of a practical, when we think about determining intensity and duration for training, we can look at a practical variable such as heart rate in order for us to kind of quantify intensities. And so a lot of endurance athletes will look at this in zone training. So zone 1 is like your active recovery. And again, you can hold that for 1 to 3 hours, no problem. Zone 2 is going to be more like a moderate intensity workout, and you should be able to hold this for 1 to 2 hours. Zone 3 is kind of hitting that lactate threshold area, and we could hold that for 30 to 90 minutes. Zone 4, we're looking at kind of a upper end lactate interval type of workout or low end like interval type of workout. So again, we can hold these for 10 to 40 minutes. So something that I might do for tempo work, I might do like a 30-minute tempo, or a lot of times like on my bike, for example, I'll do like 2 by 20-minute tempo, and those are in zone 3. Zone 4 intervals, we might do something like let's call it like 4 by 8 minutes or something along those lines. So again, that gives me 32 minutes of stress total, kind of at this upper edge. And then zone 5 is kind of like the highest intensity, and we can hold these for 5 to 10 minutes. This might be something where I want to have more quality recovery in between. So maybe I could do like, let's call it 8 by 200 meters or something along those lines. Okay, so again, for me, that would maybe take 45 seconds for each of the 200-meter sprints, and then we have plenty of recovery in between. Maybe we do 10 of those or 8, like I said. But again, we're kind of hitting that upper edge. So we think about injuries and endurance training. A lot of the injuries that we see in endurance sport are the results of overtraining. Again, we want to follow that 10% rule for progression for increasing training load. So again, that could be 10% more volume. It could be 10% greater intensity as well, or a combination of both. We get in trouble when we push above this, or if we try to do 10% volume and 10% intensity. That's too much progression. So again, it's really important that we be diligent about this. What gets tricky is when kids have other stressors outside of sport in their lives. Maybe this is they're taking private hitting lessons somewhere, and so we have that to kind of keep in mind. Maybe they have a strength and conditioning class in addition to their workouts with us after school or whatever it is. And then, if we're working with a college athlete, maybe it's something that's a psychological stress as well. So this is really common. Our body can't tell the difference between physiological and psychological stresses. So we can have a great program set up and we can still experience overtraining because these kids have stressors outside of sport that we're not able to account for when we create our programs. So again, I would say communication is really important when we're working with our athletes to kind of understand how to quantify that and how to kind of keep that in check so that we can understand that we're only doing 10% more each week. Okay, we have other injury risks as well. So again, these can be very sport specific. It could be muscle imbalances and things like that that we could kind of focus on with what we're doing in the weight room as well. Okay. So how do we train to improve the other two systems. So we talked a little bit about what we would do um, the aerobic athlete and to kind of focus on the aerobic side of things. We can also do some different workouts to specifically focus on the ATP PCR system and also on that anaerobic glycolytic system. Okay, I kind of already touched on this, but let's start with ATP PCR. So the ATP PCR system, we want to do high intensity intervals of 1 to 10 seconds in duration. Okay, so again, maybe I'm going to have them do 60-yard dashes, and then they need plenty of recovery. We need 2 to 5 minutes recovery between each set. Again, I think that we get in a lot of trouble here because we're not giving kids enough recovery in order for us to truly activate and maximize the use of the ATP PCR system. So again, if we're doing high intensity, we want these to be really quality, we've got to give them enough rest. We have to give them 2 to 5 minutes for them to recover so that they're ready to have a high quality on that next set. Okay, the glycolytic system, we can do intervals of 30 to 60 seconds. Their rest can range here, again, depending on their fitness level, depending on the point where I am in the season, how much stress I want to place in this workout. These rest intervals can be somewhere between 90 seconds to 5 minutes in duration. So I gave an example of 200-meter repeats or something like that. So again, for me, for example, maybe those take 45 seconds. So if I did 8 by 200 meters at 45 seconds each rep, and then we want to understand, okay, well, what do we want that rest interval to be? Do we want it to be 90 seconds because we want to kind of really challenge this person, or do we want them to be more like full recovery and give them 4 minutes or so that we're really allowing them to recover and give us the highest quality for each of those exercises? Really depends on your goals. Okay, so we think about strength training exercises again. We have a whole class that will focus on program design for strength training and that sort of stuff. But strength training exercises can be isometric or static. So again, think of like a plank, a wall sit, something like that. Or they can be dynamic or isotonic. And again, this is kind of probably what you think about when you think of strength training exercises. So squat, lunges, bench press, pull-ups, etc. Those are all examples of dynamic strength training exercises. Again, which is better? Honestly, I would say the dynamics are going to be significantly more applicable or more functional based on what it is that we do within sport. But it's also good to include some of those isometric types of exercises because maybe that is more comparable. We think about body position in football, for example. Maybe a plank is good because I have to keep my core tight in a static or isometric position when I go forward to tackle someone or something along those lines. So I think there is a time and a place for each of these types of exercise, depending on what our goals are and the dynamics of that particular sport. So what are some of the adaptations that we make to chronic strength training? We want to increase muscle force production. We can increase muscle mass if we kind of focus on hypertrophy. We can also focus on the neural side of strength improvements. So our neural changes involve improved synchronization of motor neuron firing and improved frequency of the signals being sent from the alpha motor neuron. So again, without even changing muscle mass, we can improve strength based on some of these principles. Okay. So think about the general strength training principles that we need to consider. We need to consider the intensity at which we'd like to go, and the intensity will in part help us to understand the number of sets and reps that we need in order to be able to manage or hit those intensities. Frequency, how many days per week should I be doing this? What muscles are going to be used during competition for that particular sport, and then the speed of those actions as well. Do we need to do power types of exercise where we're able to, with the power exercises, do things with a great amount of force and speed and kind of mimic some of those sport specific actions that are going to require high speed. This is nice. This shows us a little bit about the resistance training guidelines based on the type of athlete that we're working with. If we're working with a novice exerciser, we should shoot for 2 to 3 total body sessions per week, and we can do 1 to 3 sets per exercise. Again, I would start with 1 set so that we can kind of teach these different skills, teach these different movements. We can do 8 to 12 reps, 60 to 70% intensity with rest intervals of 2 to 3 minutes. Okay. As we move to intermediate types of athletes, we can shoot for 3 total body sessions or 4 split routines. A split routine would be like, okay, Monday I'm going to do lower body, Tuesday I'm going to do upper body, Thursday I'm going to do lower body, Friday I'm going to do upper, or something along those lines. There's lots of different ways we can split. That's just one example. You could do like a push pull or something along those lines. But that's what a split routine is. I'm not getting a full body workout in every single workout. Here we can do multiple sets. We can do reps of 8 to 12. Intensity is about the same there, 60 to 70%, and then 2 to 3 minutes between sets. And then for our advanced exercisers, we can do 4 to 6 split routines, so they can do strength training up to 6 times a week. Again, you could be advanced and not necessarily need that based on like where you fall within your season, right? So again, if I'm in season, it's just not feasible to have 6 strength training sessions per week because I have games, I have competitions, I have to work on plays and practice and things. There's just not enough time. So again, maybe in my off season, 6 days a week is a good goal, but it really just depends on the time of the year as well for these individuals. So here we can do multiple sets. We can do 1 to 12 reps, and we can use anywhere from 80 to 100% intensity and 2 to 3 minutes rest in between each set. Okay, this shows us an example of what we need to do if we want to focus on muscular endurance. And essentially what we see here is we're going to have lower rest, lower intensity, and higher reps. Okay, so increase the number of repetitions and decrease the rest interval, and that's going to allow them to focus on muscular endurance. And again, the idea with muscular endurance is I want to be able to do lots of repetitions before I reach fatigue at a submaximal level. So when we think about periodization here, so we should have systematic variation of volume and intensity over time. So again, this is something that we'll talk more about in that program design class, but essentially what we want to do is we don't want our athletes to become accustomed to what we are asking them, right? We want to use linear periodization, which means that we're kind of progressing in a logical, upended way. And again, we need to have changes in focus, changes in exercise over time, right? So again, we don't want to just do the same workout over and over and over. We have to change something in order to elicit change within the body. Okay, so systematic variation in volume and intensity over time is going to allow us to kind of keep the body guessing so that we are able to challenge the body appropriately. Okay, we can achieve optimal gains in strength, power, motor performance, and or hypertrophy. So we can set up our training so that we are focusing on a particular aspect of training. Maybe when we want to focus on strength for these 2 months, and then we're going to focus on power for these 2 months, and then we're going to do muscular endurance, whatever. Okay, so again, strength gains are going to be significantly greater if we use these kind of programmed, periodized plans in order to make this happen. Okay, we think about gender responses to strength training. It turns out that when we look at an untrained male versus an untrained female, the untrained males will have a greater kind of baseline strength in comparison to the females, and that's due to testosterone. However, when we look at both males and females as it relates to chronic change to a strength plan, we don't see any gender differences related to their starting point. Okay, so again, what I'm saying is even though women start out at like a lower level in terms of absolute strength in comparison to their male counterparts, we are able to see the same progression, right? So again, they will improve their strength at a similar rate relative to that starting point. Okay, so what does this tell me? Again, kind of similar to what I already mentioned. If I'm working with a male cross-country runner and a female cross-country runner, we don't need different plans, right? They're going to adapt in the same way. The women are just going to start at a lower absolute strength than the males. However, they will progress in the same regard. Okay. How do I combine strength training and endurance training into the same plan? So the tricky thing with this is if you're working with a sport that needs both of these, we have to combine them. We have to use both strength training and endurance training in order for us to reach our end goals. However, combining strength training and endurance training together may limit strength gains versus just doing strength training alone. But I guess the good news is there aren't very many sports that just need strength, right? We need these other aspects in sport in order for us to be successful. Okay. So if we were going to include both of these, we should perform strength and endurance training on alternate days for optimal strength gains. So again, if strength is my focus, we want to do that first, and we want to maybe use the aerobic work as kind of our recovery. Okay. What about protein? So again, we can use protein to help us in recovery from both types of exercise, both aerobic and strength training. So ingesting protein increases the rate of protein synthesis post-training. Okay, so when we think about muscle soreness, we're interested in understanding DOMS, or delayed onset muscle soreness. And this is usually a result of kind of some micro tears that occur within the muscle when we do maybe strenuous strength training. We can experience DOMS when we do any type of eccentric motion. So it could be downhill running or a lot of deceleration in workouts or in competitions. And essentially what we are looking at when we experience DOMS is an increase in inflammation, and like I said, an increase in those micro tears within the muscle fibers themselves. And so that's going to require a significant amount of recovery. DOMS usually affects us 24 to 48 hours post-exercise. So again, I would say the most common mode of exercise for us to experience DOMS is going to be strength training. However, it can come from all sorts of modes of exercise. Common treatments for DOMS, we can use stretching, ice bath, heat, sauna, foam rolling, good nutrition, good sleep, active recovery, massage. So again, all sorts of options in terms of kind of how do we get that inflammation out of the muscles. And different athletes are going to prefer different methods. Again, we have to think about what's available, what's feasible for this particular person based on their situation, based on the level of athlete that you're kind of working with. So when you think about steps leading to DOMS, or delayed onset muscle soreness, here we're kind of taking a look at what's happening from a physiological perspective. So the proposed steps, number one, we're going to experience structural damage to those muscle fibers. So again, understanding the actin and myosin and the microfilaments that make up those molecules and their interaction of the actin and myosin in order for us to experience muscle contraction, we're going to see some structural damage or some micro tears, as I mentioned, when we complete eccentric action, which is the lengthening of that muscle. So again, we'll see some damage within the muscle fibers themselves. We'll also see some damage within the membrane. So think the cell membrane or the edges of those cells. We'll experience some damage there. We have calcium kind of leaking out of the sarcoplasmic reticulum. We see a protease activation, which will result in breakdown of cellular proteins. So again, kind of understanding that breakdown process within the muscle itself. We have an inflammatory response, which will result in edema or an increase in fluid and some pain sensation in that particular area. Again, this is kind of the cascade of events that will occur. And again, this inflammatory response, I would mention, is good. This is a good thing. So again, the reason that this inflammatory response is good is because this is going to allow us to rebuild or recover that muscle to become a little bit better than what it was when we started, which is really what we're after with our training, right? We're trying to induce muscle damage so that when we repair that muscle, we're able to build it back a little stronger than what it was in the first place. Okay, so we think about flexibility and flexibility training. So again, stretching exercises can be used to improve flexibility. And we think about the types of stretching that we can do. Sky's the limit here. We can do static stretching, which is those stretches that we kind of hold for a set amount of time, be it 10 to 30 seconds, kind of somewhere in that range. And again, we should complete static stretching at the end of our workouts to kind of signal to those receptors that we are done with the exercise. Okay, we can do dynamic stretching, which is a more active movement type of stretch where we're moving our joints through range of motion. So think like leg swings, or think some of the dynamic exercises, quad pulls, knee hugs, walking lunges, all of those types of movements where we're trying to put that joint through a range of motion. We're trying to do that with active muscle contraction. And again, the idea with those dynamic stretches is we want to have functional range of motion and activate the muscle mass as it moves through that full range of motion. Okay, so we should complete our dynamic stretches at the beginning of our workouts. We can also use something called PNF stretching, or proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation. And this is kind of like a specific or a specific type of partner stretching. Okay, so with this type of partner stretching, we are going to push that person passively through a particular range of motion to the end of that range of motion, and then ask them to contract the muscle in order for them to return to whatever that starting position is. Again, this is a skilled type of flexibility training. That it can be really effective. It can also be super time consuming, because again, if I have two athletes doing PNF stretching on each other, it's going to take me the full time to stretch my partner, and then I have to take the full time to get myself stretched by my partner. So again, it can be a little bit time consuming, but can be really effective, particularly if we have athletes that have struggled with injuries related to muscle tightness and that sort of thing in the past. If we have a trained athletic trainer available that could do this type of stretching for that type of problematic athlete, or an athlete that's had those problems, I should say, that would be another great option. So when we think about ACSM's flexibility recommendations, again, we are interested in improving joint range of motion or flexibility, and this can be improved across all age groups. So it really doesn't matter who you are. All of us would benefit from doing flexibility training, and we could all see improvements in our range of motion regardless of who we are. So frequency, we should shoot for 2 to 3 times per week for at least 3 to 4 weeks. Volume, we want to shoot for 60 seconds of flexibility per joint. So again, if I'm looking at my hamstrings, for example, maybe there's 3 different stretches that I want to have an athlete do. However, we're going to do 20 seconds per stretch in order to accumulate 60 seconds total for that particular joint. Those PNF stretches that we talked about, we can hold those for about 10 to 30 seconds per joint or per contraction. Okay, and the intensity at which we'd like to go, it's to the point of tightness or slight discomfort. Again, this is going to range greatly from person to person in terms of what is kind of that starting range of motion that we have for that particular person. So when we think about year-round conditioning for our athletes, again, it's important for us to think about how to periodize this. So how do we set up our training so that we're ready for our athletes to peak at the appropriate times? How do we taper them so that they are ready to perform at the highest level during that championship phase of our season? Okay, so in the off season, this is just an example of suggested activities that we could kind of incorporate in a year-round training program. So in our off season, we can focus on weight training, running, skill practice. So again, maybe a kind of fundamental level of skill practice. As we move through each of these phases, our skill practice is going to become more important and more specific, and also going to be more challenging, right? So we want to kind of start with those baseline activities, or kind of our easiest fundamental elements of sport, and kind of build into some of those harder elements in sport. Also in our off season, it's not uncommon for us to have our athletes participating in other sports or other activities, other recreation, to just gain general fitness. Okay. As we move into the preseason, again, we want to maintain weight training. As we move to our in-season, now the weight training is going to become more maintenance-based. So instead of really focusing on building strength or hypertrophy, we're really interested during our in-season in focusing on the sports skills and kind of maintaining whatever strength gains or whatever hypertrophy gains we've experienced in our off-season and preseason. Okay. Learn strategies, again, trying to increase that intensity as we move through preseason and into our in-season training. So here we're looking at ACSM guidelines for children in regards to physical activity. Again, what's the separation between what children should be doing and when do we develop kind of sport specific training for children as they enter into, maybe it's middle school, maybe it's high school, whatever that level is, whatever that changeover where we become a little bit more specific with what we're doing in a sports related setting, can vary substantially from person to person. Okay, so again, we have to consider the maturity of the athlete, their interest in kind of specialization and all those types of things. Again, maybe not a topic to get into a whole lot in this particular unit, but really something interesting to think about when we separate out children from adults or children from athletes, right? So in general, if we're thinking about, we're working with children or younger individuals that aren't necessarily sports specific training, we want to shoot for 60 minutes of physical activity 3 days a week. But honestly, pretty much every day would be better. Okay, 60 minutes as part of physical education, sport, free play, planned activity. Okay. Activities should be moderate to vigorous. This can include strength training. This can include aerobic work. And maybe you're thinking like, wow, strength training for kids, like that seems pretty intense. But again, you have to remember strength training for kids can involve like doing the monkey bars or climbing up a little rock climbing wall at the playground, right? Jumping off of stuff. My kids love jumping off of things. And again, that is strength training. That is muscle strengthening, bone strengthening exercise that could be incorporated into this free play. Okay. So lots of different options there. It doesn't have to be a scheduled, like we're not having them on the elliptical. We want to have them playing. We want to have them having fun. The other thing my kids really like to do is set up little obstacle courses in the driveway and things like that. And they'll ride their bikes or they'll run or they'll jump or they'll throw a ball or whatever it is, to kind of be active and kind of participating in general movement. Okay. Again, activities for youth should be developmentally appropriate and offer a variety, be enjoyable. There's so many great options for kids to just get active. And again, I mentioned, playing outside is a really simple way for kids to get active. Just a couple examples. So like our kids, like we have a trampoline, so that, or maybe it's swimming in the summer. One of my daughters really likes to do like little yoga videos. So we'll do little, there's like family friendly or kid yoga videos that she likes to do. So lots of different options in terms of kind of how we appropriately challenge them based on the age and based on their interests. So when we think about common training mistakes as coaches, what are some of the common errors that coaches make? We've got overtraining as a big error. Again, overtraining is kind of doing too much too soon. And I think the reason that we see overtraining as a major issue in sports is often because of one of two things. Number one, not great communication from athlete to coach. So I have an athlete coming into my season and I'm under the impression that they did all the things that they were supposed to do in their off season and they're coming in ready to go. And maybe they're not, right? Maybe they didn't do those things. So the lines of communication aren't good. And now I'm putting that athlete at risk for overtraining because I believed they did what they told me to do and they didn't, right? So maybe that's some sort of issue there with communication or honesty from the athlete perspective, or just a lack of education from the athlete's perspective about why we want to know that, right? The other major reason is we're asking athletes to do too much too soon and they didn't do anything in their off season, right? So again, if you have a kid that's coming in that's been sedentary for X amount of time, right? Man, it's hard to really kind of ease them in when you have practice 5 or 6 days a week. They're going from nothing to 5 or 6 days a week of practice. Again, pretty common for me to see at the high school level, probably not so much of a concern at the collegiate level as we're having those athletes probably more bought in than the average high schooler is. So again, overtraining can become an issue because of those factors. Undertraining is another concern. So again, trying to find a way to appropriately stress athletes based on where their current fitness is, right? So again, it requires a lot of communication. The other issue with this is I don't know how my athlete feels, and sometimes they're not willing to vocalize that. Or I have so many athletes that it's hard to have these individual conversations with every single one of them. And again, so this can lead to some undertraining for some athletes. Okay. Other common mistakes involve performing non-specific exercises. So again, thinking about doing exercises that are not specific to what that athlete needs to challenge the body. Other issues include a lack of long-term training plan. So again, when we think about how we want our athletes to progress as they move through our program, let's say we have them for 4 years, whether you're working, at the high school level or collegiately, or even if I'm working with middle schoolers and I have them for a couple years, thinking about how I'm going to progress them over time. So each season isn't its own entity, right? How can I build this season on what we did last season for each individual athlete? And again, that can be really challenging when you have a big team and you have a big variety of ability levels and things like that. So thinking about how we can develop them kind of long term. And then lastly, failure to taper before performance. Again, if everything's going well, the athletes are feeling good, and we're ready to taper or kind of decrease their volume and intensity, kind of leading into those championship competitions, that's going to allow them to perform really well at the end of their season. So kind of planning out your programming so that we are ready to taper at the appropriate time is really important. So I mentioned overtraining again. I would, in my opinion, again, as a high school coach, I would much rather have my athletes show up to the starting line undertrained versus overtrained. The reason for that is I want them to be on that start line. I want them to be able to participate in the sport. If I have a bunch of kids that have stress fractures or, tight hamstring issues or IT band syndrome or whatever the condition may be, it's really hard for us to get them to the start line, right? So I'd rather have them a little bit undertrained versus overtrained just due to the nature of the sport that I coach. And again, when we think about building or developing athletes, I would rather them be healthy and excited about sport versus feeling burnout and having to face injuries and things like that. So again, I'm maybe pretty conservative with training for most of my athletes just because of those factors. Okay, so again, when we think about overtraining, how do we know when an athlete's experiencing these feelings? Number one, we've got a decrease in. So again, some of the concerns with overtraining, we're going to experience a decrease in performance, a loss of body weight, increase in number of infections, or increased risk of sickness, chronic fatigue, elevated heart rate and blood lactate levels during exercise, and psychological staleness, or just kind of that feeling of like, I'm just not excited, I'm just not interested, I'm just kind of feeling a little like worn down and not really motivated to perform or motivated to challenge myself in these workouts. So again, I would say that the greatest symptom of overtraining is kind of this feeling of chronic fatigue, right? So again, if these athletes, if they're coming into every workout or coming into every practice, just kind of feeling like, oh, my legs feel like crap, or I feel really heavy, or I just don't feel quick, or I'm just not excited. And it becomes more, every day versus, once in a while, we do want them to feel fatigued, right? That means that they worked hard. However, we can't have them heading into every workout kind of feeling that way, or we are going to put them at great risk for injury, right? So I think that's all for today. Hope you have a great day, and please, as always, reach out if you have any questions.